Thank you everybody for joining. We'll go ahead and get started now. Just want to do a couple of housekeeping items before we jump in. We ask that if you could all remain on mute during the course of the webinar, and for questions, if you could just submit your questions through the chat. We'll do our best to get to questions as we go through. Just for everybody's information, we will be recording the session, and we look forward to your questions as we go through it. So to jump in, the topic of discussion today is to discuss the geographical impact of COVID on the workplace and employees specifically. And we'll go through a number of topics on the subject and do our best to give kind of different perspectives on the impact that we see it having on a variety of different things. Before we jump in, we'll do a quick round of introductions. I'll get things started. So I am Zachary Tweddle, Senior Director of Marketing and Employer Brand at Bayard. For those of you who don't know Bayard, Bayard is a full-service recruitment marketing agency. We help companies with anything from media buying, employer branding, social media, search engine marketing, and a variety of other things as far as end-to-end recruiting is concerned. Matt, would you like to do a brief introduction?
Yes, I'm Matthew Kahn. I'm an economist at Johns Hopkins University, and I'm the director of the 21st Century Cities Initiative, a center that focuses on urban economic growth and the challenges and opportunities firms face in our changing cities.
Thanks, Matt. Mac?
Hi, I'm Mac McComas, and I'm the Senior Program Manager at Johns Hopkins 21st Century Cities Initiative, where I work with Professor Kahn on a lot of our research looking at neighborhood quality of life and policy analysis.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. So we'll go ahead and jump right in. And again, as we go through the different topics, please feel free to submit your questions. As I said, we'll do our best to get to them as we go through, but we will have a brief question and answer period at the end for those that we miss on the way through. Okay, so our first topic is looking at office demand and what we think the short and long-term impact of COVID will be on that. And specifically as we look at major cities and obviously the office space within that. Mac, I'll start with you. What is your perspective on kind of the impact that we see it having on office space demand?
Sure. Thanks, Zach. So I think, if you look sort of at the national picture, you're going to see vacancy rates for office space that are near historic lows in some places. And this is mostly due to long-term leases that companies have to sign on office space. But if you look at non-residential construction, it's down this year and especially down in the summer months. So down by 4% compared to the same time last year. And just to give some perspective, it's risen every year since 2011 annually. So I think you're going to see a short-term cooling of sort of the demand for office space, but there are still those markets that might be hot. So for example, Google has proposed a 40-acre mixed-use campus in Mountain View with up to 1.3 million square feet of office space. Another example is a group called Alexandria Real Estate Equities, which has closed on 250 acres of the Durham Research Triangle for $590 million. So those industries that are still doing well in pandemic times, like tech and the biomedical industry, they're still showing some strong demand there.
Thanks, Matt. Matt, anything to add to that?
Yes. So the academic nerds have been in deep talks pre-COVID about firm fragmentation. So firms like Goldman Sachs keeping many of their senior management downtown, but moving many of their employees to suburban locations. So something that interests me very much here is going forward, I think we're going to continue to see commercial demand in our superstar cities, but of keeping firms thinking about which of their employees will perhaps people who live in the suburbs will want to be in suburban locations, in suburban office space and or working from home, versus other employees living and working downtown in the superstar cities. I am an optimist about our great cities that, that they're gonna withstand the aftermath of COVID. But I do think that every firm is gonna take a close look at what they've learned from the recent experience with remote work.
Awesome, thank you both. And just to kind of add to that and maybe pose another question, do you think that that will vary based on, from a talent perspective, will that vary based on role, based on tenure? Do you think, I think if we think of younger generations, they typically thrive in the ability to network within major cities. Do we think that maybe those who are more tenured may be willing to start to leave major cities and go to more rural areas? Or do you think it's kind of going to be something that is across the board? Matt, I think you're muted.
Even my son just returned to the University of Chicago, even though all his classes are on Zoom. He wants to have face-to-face contact with his friends, properly social distance, but he wants to see his friends while his father and mother are Zooming in our lectures from home. So Zach, I think you nailed it. The young workforce, both for marriage markets and fun, I think our cities are going to get younger and perhaps more affordable. And so I think there will be this desire among the young to continue to be at places of work, and they're going to need to be mentored. It's middle management who, and upper management, 50-year-olds like me, who sort of comfortably head to remote work. And
okay, Mac, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I'll just double down on what Matt said, is that mentoring is so important. As anybody who's worked with employees who are just out of college and transitioning into the workforce, it's a totally different style of life. They don't know what to wear even, and this is something that they're going to have to take cues on, or how to act in the workplace. And so there's just a lot of practical things that they need to learn on the ground while they're in a physical space that's much easier to do when you're in person and can't really be done online.
Perfect. That makes a lot of sense. So that actually leads us nicely into the second topic. So if I go kind of thinking of people within the workplace who maybe are considering moving out of major cities, and even employers who are thinking of moving out of major cities, who do we think will lead that charge? Is it something that we anticipate employers will lead, or do we think it's something that is going to be maybe role-based? In some roles, I think of tech, for example, high-skilled tech employees are going to have a lot of leverage in terms of where they can work. Or do we think, I'd love to get your perspective on that in terms of who you think will drive that change.
So from my perspective, I've learned from Nick Bloom at Stanford. So Professor Bloom is claiming that many of tech workers will be engaging in remote work 2 to 3 days a week. That effectively shortens their commute and would allow them to move further and further into the suburbs, or it unbundles place of work from place of residence. And so for workers, this is a pay raise, the opportunity to have this non-taxed benefit of commuting less and having more time at home. So I think firms that offer the opportunity for remote work will have an easier time hiring workers.
Yeah, I completely agree. Mac, anything to add?
Yeah, well, I'll just speak a little bit about my generation, the millennials, who, in some part really drove a lot of the back to the city movement. And what you were seeing is all these stories about millennials preferring cities and not wanting suburbs. But in the past couple of years, you've seen a trend of millennials increasingly moving out to suburbs, getting larger houses, marrying, settling down, and having kids. And what was really happening is that they were delaying marriage and delaying buying a house and moving out to the suburbs. So what I think this pandemic might do is accelerate that trend. So for couples that were already thinking about maybe buying a house in the suburbs in 1 or 2 years, they're going to take this opportunity and jump on it. So because of that, you know, you might see a large spike in that population suburbanizing.
And Zach, I want to pick up on that just briefly. Real estate economists have noted how difficult it is to build housing in many center cities like San Francisco and New York. And this pushed the millennial generation out into the suburbs, just facing this real estate gradient. And so that lowered the middle class's purchasing power. And so remote work combined with center city zoning has powerful implications for upcoming labor demand dynamics.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think if we think of it from an employer perspective too, there are obviously markets that have become incredibly saturated, and it becomes incredibly difficult for certain companies to hire specific talent. If we think of tech in San Francisco, for example, or tech in other major markets in the US, we may see companies start to drive that a little bit and offer more remote opportunities if they are having a really difficult time hiring the type of talent that they need within the major markets. So I think in those instances, we might see it driven a little bit more by employers, not necessarily leaving cities, but offering more remote opportunities a little freer than they had in the past.
And Zach, if I can pick up there, the ability of a firm to search on the national market, you can, with remote work, you can run an audition and see if it's a good fit without somebody moving to Seattle. You can see if a Baltimore-based data scientist is a good fit with Amazon. So there's all sorts of possibilities and permutations and short-run cheap auditions when firms allow for the possibility of remote work.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think one of the things that we've learned as an organization over the course of COVID is that in working with our clients and in working with vendor partners, there are a lot of things out there that really help companies in terms of remote hiring. Right? When you think through the process of interviewing people, getting to know people, onboarding people, there really has been a surge in technologies and tools that are available to help companies do that. So it's much easier to do than it had been in the past, understanding that there's just been this overarching need for it.
And Zach, I'd like to add, it will increase diversity of the workforce for firms seeking to hire more minorities and women. I think there's many more permutations than that you have to move to Seattle or Silicon Valley to get that job. And so there's a sort of a democratization, if that's a word, offered by remote work.
Absolutely. Yeah, I totally agree. Mac, anything additional on before we move to the next topic?
Yeah, well, I think I want to highlight something you said, which is this sort of difficulty of hiring in some of these major cities. And I think if you look at somebody like Steve Case and his Rise of the Rest investment fund looking to invest in tech opportunities in sort of mid-sized metro areas, that was a recognition that there is talent there. There are companies there. There's just not a lot. There's just not that sort of aggregate demand that you'll get in somewhere like New York City or San Francisco. So he was trying to drive capital there, and people enjoyed living in these places because the cost of living was much lower and the quality of life was relatively high. So I think more and more people will start to see this and start to invest in those companies.
Yeah, absolutely. So jumping to the next one, they kind of dovetail together pretty nicely. But if we think of I know we've touched on tech and sort of software development as the prime example. But if we think of high skilled workers and their ability to move to remote locations, do you guys have any perspective on kind of the skill sets that we think lend themselves best to working remotely and moving to remote areas? Or do we think it's kind of going to be a case-by-case thing?
So I'll just tell a short little story about a friend of mine who works at a graphic design company in Baltimore City, but he lives in Jackson Hole. And this is a guy who was a veteran and really enjoyed the outdoors, but he had been sort of in the business doing graphic and web design long enough that a company in Baltimore recognized his talent and recognized that they might lose him to somewhere else if they didn't let him live a majority of his time in Jackson Hole and enjoy the outdoors with his free time. And so he flies into Baltimore City, 4 or 5 times a year for big, important client meetings. But the rest of his time, because his job can essentially be done all online, he's been doing that for, I'd say, the past 7 years now. And this company has gained from getting this high talent individual who might have left for somewhere like Denver that has closer proximity to the mountains rather than Baltimore City.
What I love about Mac's example is this ability to have it all. In the past, when you had to live and work in the same local labor market, Mac's friend in Jackson Hole would have not had found the best job for him. And so when people have funky preferences for the environment and special skills, remote work in the post-COVID world offers the opportunity to have it all. And Zach, the other point I'd want to make is people who live in small environmental areas, when they have access to remote work, they have incentives to have really specialized skills because it's as if they're in a major local market that they can sell their skills on a platform like Upwork to the whole nation. And that creates an incentive to pursue skill.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think there are a number of different life circumstances as well that are going to drive a lot of these decisions, right? When we talk a little bit about, Mac, you had mentioned the millennial generation and looking at families and wanting to buy homes. I'll tell a little story about my wife works as a behavior analyst and works children with autism. And they've seen a lot of people, an influx into schools where she works, people coming from different states. And the reason for that is a lot of jobs now have more flexibility to kind of seek those extra benefits for children or others where it makes sense, and now have more freedom to do that, where in the past, maybe they were tied to a specific market because of their need to work in a specific field or work at a particular organization.
Zach, I'd want to mention 20 years ago, my wife and I wrote a paper on power couples. We focused on that in a world without remote work, couples who both wanted to have satisfying careers had to move to the big city to find good matches for both of them. In a remote work world, there's many more permutations and possibilities for couples and for both of them to not sacrifice in the relationship. So slightly related to number 3, if 2 skiers are in love with each other and they want to be in some mountain range with remote work, of their ability to match with firms, there's 2 sides to all of us, the play side and the work side, and just the amazing permutations in a remote work world.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, couldn't agree more. Mac, anything else to add before we move to the next one?
Yeah, so I'll offer a little middle ground between Baltimore City and Jackson Hole. I mean, looking at some of the data, I think what you've been seeing is an increasing demand for what might be sort of traditional vacation spots near metro areas. So like a Lake Tahoe is to a San Francisco. So Truckee, California, which is a city about 3 hours away from San Francisco and has half the median home price of San Francisco, is seeing a huge increase in demand. I think their demand is up 23% compared to last year for them. And so I think you're going to see a rising demand for places that people are familiar with. So Cape Cod, the Hamptons, Aspen, that maybe are, not the other side of the country or the middle of nowhere, but it's something they're comfortable with and used to, but still, near the action where they can drive to the city if they need to. So there's sort of that middle ground.
And Zach, I want to pick up on what Max said, because I'm also seeing something in the chat room. As some Americans make these choices to go to some of the places Max said, this sorting, for those who love the center city amenities, rents will actually be cheaper. So in the past, you had to move to Seattle if you wanted to be a data scientist. You no longer have to. And this sort of spatial evening out, that we won't have such spikes in productivity, means that For those who love the opera in New York City, it will actually become cheaper from simple supply and demand. And so there are these price effects for those who remain in these cities of shaving off some of the peaks in demand where those peaks occurred because you had to live and work in the same place. And remote work relaxes that constraint.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, I'm glad you picked up on that because I was about to pose the question. Yeah, I mean, I think to the question in the chat, there is tremendous value attached to urban amenities for specific individuals. And, I think we can't write that off. But, to Matt's point, I think we will see an opportunity for that to maybe be more accessible to a larger audience because of the supply and demand and the factor that will have on the cost of urban amenities. Okay. So, we touched a lot in the last point on kind of high skilled workers. And if we think through the impact in the marketplace as a whole, both professionally and hourly jobs, and, how do we see that playing out? Matt, I'll go to you first for your perspective on how do you think that's going to play out for professional jobs versus hourly roles? Will we see a situation whereby we see a shortage of people in hourly roles because people are moving out of these key markets? What are your thoughts on that?
I love your question. I'm writing a nerdy academic paper on the following. You can think of each of us as a bundle of brains and muscle. You can't use remote work to arbitrage muscle. If I'm going to take a job in Charlotte in construction, I'm going to have to move there. You can't remote work in. So with many brain jobs, you can zoom yourself in and compete for that. So I think that for folks, we know this, that the educated will gain more from the remote work era. But Zach, I want to come back to the second part of your question. In general equilibrium, as more people move from the wage per unit of muscle would actually go up as people leave that sector. And so as you shift in the number of workers in an industry, wages go up as those workers leave to a remote work sector. And so I do think we're going to see these pricing effects of gains in sectors where people leave. When people leave and engage in remote work, this has benefits for the middle class who remain in sectors that can't engage in remote work.
Yeah, makes sense. Mac, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I just to highlight some of what Matt said, I think you are seeing that obviously there are still these jobs that that need to still exist in cities and can't be done remotely. And you're seeing challenges for firms hiring people like Walmart, and I'm seeing every Burger King I drive by seeing a help wanted sign. So they're struggling with this question of a huge need to hire hourly workers, and it'll be interesting to see how that plays out in the long run. But certainly in the short term, they're finding a big challenge.
And that leads to wage increases. I agree with Matt.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, if we think through the opportunities for maybe professional talent in smaller markets, right? The ability to take up those jobs in markets outside of the major cities is going to create more opportunity for people who maybe grew up in smaller markets and had no interest of moving to the larger cities. There is going to be more opportunity there for those candidates as well. Not to mention the kind of ease of access to online education and skill-specific education online now as well. The ability to kind of develop those skills is going to be much more accessible for people as well. So there's a couple of questions because I know we're going to shift a little bit in the latter half of the presentation. There are a couple of questions in the chat that I just wanted to pose to you both. And one of them comes about kind of the mixed model and how it may become less attractive than 100% work from home arrangement. And so we're talking a lot about kind of short and long-term effects of COVID. Can we really have all that much insight into the long-term effects, understanding that we're kind of in this situation where a lot of the things that we typically do with our time are not open or not available to us. So it's not distracting us from the work that we're doing at home. What are your thoughts on kind of that mixed model being slightly less attractive than the situation we find ourselves in now?
So, Zach, the Nobel Prize in 2019 in economics went to three economists who estimate field experiments. We know that we don't know how each firm and person is affected by remote work. Firms are going to experiment and see if there's workers' productivity and if their face-to-face interactions when they do go to work is improved or hurt by offering remote work. And so, Zach, I'm going to give you a wishy-washy academic answer that when firms know that they don't know the answer to that great question, they're going to experiment and they're going to learn, and these profit maximizers will pursue the best strategy once they've learned that information. And so 2020 has been a big field experiment, and every firm has learned different lessons about how it gains and what it loses from having less face-to-face interaction at the office.
Yeah. Mac, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I'll say at the firm level, I think you've already seen some of that of those firms who think by coming back early, by opening up more early, that that there are gains to be had there, that they'll be seen as more adept by consumers. So I think similar to employees who might think, oh, if I get back in the office sooner and if I interact more face-to-face with my employer, there might be gains there. But again, to Matt's point, we don't know the answer to that. We don't know if this is going to prove out in the long term, but I think you do see certain people and certain firms who are more eager to open up and go back to sort of this face-to-face.
And Zach, I'd add to that there's quantity versus quality. Tenured faculty don't go to the office every day. We're slightly unusual people, as Mac knows. And so some faculty members go in 2 days a week that are very charming on those days. So there's quality and there's quantity of interactions, and every firm has to think about its creativity, its production process, and why does it need face-to-face interaction between junior people in the firm, managers, and the creative types. Why is face-to-face interaction so important in 2020?
Yeah, absolutely. And to kind of dovetail into another point that was made in the chat, and we touched on this a little bit earlier, in the sense that more tenured people who have already kind of built their networks are slightly more willing to leave the major cities because there's less of a need for that benefit from the city. But a point was made in the chat that people just starting out, the major benefit around networking and things like that are still going to be there in the major cities. And I think to touch on a point that you made, Matt, not only is that still going to be the case, but it also may lead to it being slightly easier for people earlier in their careers to move to the cities, just because costs may be slightly lower than they are today, given that the demand is not as high. Anything to add on that point, Matt or Mike?
I love the logic. It raises the question for senior mentors at firms. Well, perhaps there's two types. If there's people who love a mentoring role, as a professor, I'm a mentor, you might get self-selection, that the people who want to hide out in the suburbs will do less mentoring at the firm, and those who are committed to interacting with young people will go to the office more and interact with the young, and hopefully the firm's culture will reward those guys. They won't be suckers for their public goods provision to the firm, because it takes two to tango in a mentor-mentee relationship. Someone on the senior level has to show up and do that.
Absolutely. Yeah, Mac, anything to add?
Yeah, I'll just highlight another benefit of cities is that it's not so much just the face-to-face interactions, but the random face-to-face interactions. So, I've worked with a bunch of economists, but if I'm on the Hopkins campus and I run into an engineer and we talk for 5 minutes and figure out that we're working on the same issue, but coming at it from different perspectives, we both stand to gain a whole lot from that. And if we're working remotely, that's much harder to do. So and I'm not sure how you replace that. So you might see those more sort of curious, knowledge, young, hungry minds more willing to be in the city because they do get to discover new people and new places, and there are obvious benefits to that.
Yeah, Matt, I'll circle back to your point as well, and maybe pose another question of, we talk a lot about the face-to-face interaction and the ability to kind of mentor in that capacity. Is it not becoming as easy to do that remotely? As a professor, what does that look like on your side, the ability to kind of mentor and teach from a distance? Is that something does something get lost without that face-to-face? What is your perception on that side of things?
It's very difficult to read a room on Zoom. So for business people talking in groups of 12, it's in a one-on-one office hour in Zoom. You're right, it's a perfect substitute. But if I'm speaking to a room of 25 people face-to-face, I can read the room so much better than if we're on Zoom. And that actually unnerves me a little because I like to know, I'd like to have a good guess of when I interact with young people, what they are thinking, and I can't read them in a Zoom room.
Makes sense. Mac, any perspective on that?
Yeah, again, I've more done small group collaboration, but I think in some ways, it's been easier working with some of our undergraduate research assistants because it's easier to show, because so much of what we do is online, it's easier to demonstrate and sort of teach some of those skills. But to Matt's point, there is this sort of size and group effect. So I think it really depends on what you're training people and mentoring people in, and B, just what the size of the group is.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And we work with a lot of companies who do a lot of high volume hiring, and a lot of times they'll bring employees in classes. And so it's an interesting discussion point, is how does that play out? And yes, there are a number of tools that are available in order to help companies do that at scale. But it will be interesting to see kind of as we move forward, how many companies are willing to stay within that framework or shift back to kind of the methods that are tried and true over a period of time.
In fact, I build on that of how a remote firm builds esprit de corps, of will there be face-to-face nights to bring the group together, of believing in the mission of the company. Will that be harder to build up that good culture for firms that are mostly remote? And that's a work in progress. Firms that know that they don't know the answer will experiment on that margin.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a challenge faced by all companies today. And I think there are a number of things that companies are kind of trying to do to address it. I've heard a lot of companies doing things like, as you go through different virtual stages of whether it's interviewing or onboarding process, they'll actually send you gifts as you make it through each stage with personalized notes. And there are things for existing employees whereby people will actually ship you the things that you need to participate in a virtual happy hour or things like that. So I think companies are already experimenting in that sense, in terms of being able to continue to drive that positive culture, but doing it remotely. Because, to your point, it's something that is not easy to do. And I think it's interesting to see the different experiments that go on with that. Okay. So a little bit of a shift in direction here, going from kind of the workforce and things like that, and into a little bit more of higher education. And how does the increase in remote workers impact the demand for higher education? And if we look at initially just talking through the supply and demand for higher education, and what does that start to look like if we think through, there are going to be kind of quicker, cheaper, skill-based options that are available online. Is that something that we're going to see drive the demand for higher education down? What are your thoughts on this kind of being in higher education? What does that look like from your perspective?
I'm a fan of lifelong learning. So when I was young, there was a debate at the University of Chicago on whether job training, which Bill Clinton at the time in the 90s was promoting, can you teach old dogs new tricks? And there was a pessimism back in the 1990s of the challenges of job training. But Zach, in a world of Khan Academy, and I am not the father of Khan Academy is Khan. In a world of Khan Academy, in the world of remote work, I think that there are strong incentives for people to keep their skills sharp and to reinvent themselves, that there's so many jobs that people will be able to compete for if they have the skills. And as we think about the well-being of the American middle class, we're going to have a national debate on whether we're optimists or pessimists of the ability of, if there's a skills mismatch, of are there steps I can take to raise my game? And Zach, there's increasing internet tools giving you that option. And the empirical question is, will people embrace it? And I think they will, but we don't know that yet.
Yeah, absolutely. Mac, anything to add to that?
Yeah, so I'll just talk a little bit about a somewhat related project that Matt and I are working right now on the digital divide in cities that has really been pushed to the forefront. And I think it's more correctly be closer to the mark if you called it a chasm rather than a divide. But I think it's laid bare sort of how important tech skills and digital literacy are, because the people that have been able to keep their jobs during this pandemic and have been able to keep stable employment have been much more comfortable than those that haven't. And specifically looking at schools and children, it was already a fact before the pandemic that students with better computers and laptops and higher speed broadband connection would learn more than students that were, they only had a smartphone and a data plan. So these our awareness and knowledge of this as an issue is being accelerated. And so I think that will sort of drive demand up into higher education and realizing that tech skills are so important.
Yeah.
And Zach, I would add to that remote work creates this opportunity to engage in moonlighting. And so this ability to spend even more time engaging in remote work creates incentives for people to think about upgrading their skills. And so it's an interesting example of demand creating supply.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think if I go back to a point that we talked about a little bit earlier in terms of the demand for hourly workers in different markets, if people are moving out of those markets into remote positions, then does that create more demand for people coming out of high school directly into the workforce? And does that kind of lessen the need for higher education in that sense as well? So I think that's going to be a factor too. It'll be interesting to see how that plays out in different markets.
Matt, can you speak a little bit about our work in Baltimore about the vocational trades? I think it's exactly on point.
Yeah, so we've been looking into career and technical education training in Baltimore City high schools and how that relates to labor market resilience. Keeping in mind that as students graduate from high school or trade schools, there is this period of figuring out exactly what you're going to do in the labor market, and that sort of these more tech and career focused education pathways might have the effect where they help people realize what their skills are earlier in the game and give them that sort of head start over their peers. And there is some early research on this highlighting the benefits to this type of education. And again, the question is, will we see that increase even more?
Absolutely. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I think to kind of shift a little bit as well, but in similar vein, I know you both have strong opinions on this topic in particular, and thinking through the impact on college communities, right? If you think through the businesses that exist in these communities and the impact that even in the short term, people not being on campus, less foot traffic, and the impact that that could have. What are your thoughts on, obviously we know a little bit about the short term, but how that starts to play out longer term as well?
Yeah, so I'll highlight a couple examples. So we've already seen our first casualty of the COVID era, which was McMurray College in Jacksonville, Illinois, which closed permanently in May. Now it was a relatively small liberal arts college. It had 500 students, 100 employees. But there are a lot of these sort of private liberal arts colleges in small towns. And take, for example, Ithaca. 40% of employed people in that city work for the university there. And so there are a lot of these small towns across the US whose economies are heavily reliant on the colleges that are located there. And so if you see them start to get squeezed, and they're certainly already very financially squeezed, relying heavily on room and board to drive their income, this might just push them to a tipping point. So there's a professor of education at UPenn who estimates that 20% of private liberal arts colleges are on the verge of financial collapse, and this might just be enough to push some of them over. But I'll just say, even a relatively large college in a relatively large city like Hopkins in Baltimore, there are still main streets right by campus who are heavily reliant on student and faculty populations for their business. So they're definitely going to be hurting a little bit as well.
Zach, something I want to add to what Max said is to think about, I'm more optimistic about colleges in places where people getting closer to retirement would think about living. For many older people, universities are exciting. The green space, the libraries, the culture, the sports teams, the arts. And so those universities in high quality of life areas where aging seniors could enjoy their retirement there, perhaps good hospitals associated with the university. I'm very optimistic about them. This is just to dovetail about demographics, the aging of the baby boomers, with the rise of remote work, with which college communities could have strong local service sectors going forward. I would bet on the quality of life areas because universities can be a magnet for successful aging people like me.
No, that makes total sense. And yeah, I mean, I don't have a whole lot to add to that. I think what both of you said makes total sense. I'd agree wholeheartedly. So in terms of topics, that brings us to the end of the topics that we wanted to address today. I think we addressed the questions that had come in throughout the course of the webinar. So thank you for submitting those. If you have any more, our contact information is here. We're always open to talk and answer any additional questions. I know there's a lot of information that's been kind of thrown your way today. One side note on that is we are going to be releasing a co-authored white paper at some point next week that discusses more kind of the geographic factors, not specific to COVID, but just that drive a lot of circumstances within kind of workforce planning and recruitment nationwide. So be on the lookout for that for sure. But secondly, thank you everybody for joining today. We certainly appreciate your participation. It's been a pleasure for us to kind of discuss these topics. We've enjoyed it. Hopefully we'll get an opportunity to do it again. Matt and Mac, I thank you guys for joining and jumping on, being part of the conversation. And I'll give you both the floor to add any comments.
So Zach, this was great for me. I'm actually writing a book on how the rise of remote work will affect people, firms, and places. And so it was great to have a dry run here. And maybe I'll sell 3 or 4 copies of this book. While Zooms would seem to be small, I actually think that it's going to really help the middle class of our country for the reasons we talked about today, of creating new opportunities. And there was something undemocratic when there was only just a handful of sort of superstar cities. They weren't affordable and they weren't the right fit for everybody. And so I'm excited to live in a world with this mixed opportunity for remote work and continued face-to-face.
Absolutely. Mac, anything to add before we wrap up?
No, I'll just, say thanks for the opportunity, and, certainly feel free to reach out if anything you said interested you, or you'd like to know more, or you thought we were wrong. We always welcome criticism.
Perfect. Thank you again, everybody. We hope to hear we do have one final question, actually, Matt. For you specifically, if you can zoom in from rural US, why can't you zoom in from China? Can't remote work lead to increased global competition?
So I talk about that in my new book. We've seen with radiology what has happened. And so there's going to be very interesting issues about occupational licensing. And the person who asked the question is absolutely right about international competition. We get into the following question. When we face more competition, does that just shift out a supply curve, lowering our wage? Or do we raise our game? So can there actually be a race to the top? And so I believe in the people of the United States. I believe in our educational system, and I think we have a comparative advantage in moving up the skill distribution. So I actually welcome this competition, but the person who posed that is an excellent economist, and that is a great question.
Excellent. And we do have one more. So we touched, Matt, I think you touched on this a little bit earlier, very briefly, but when we think through the ability to kind of recruit and attract diverse talent in organizations, it's obviously a key point for organizations across the country and worldwide. What do we think in an era of remote work, what are kind of the opportunities and maybe the dangers of that?
I love this question. I would say that Southwest Airlines is a key part of the puzzle. So Zach, in my new book, I talk about African-American data scientists who some might not want to move to Seattle and might want to be based in Baltimore. If Amazon opens up a HQ2 in Virginia nearby Baltimore, there is this ability for talented young African-Americans who are skilled in what Amazon needs to work at that HQ2 and to keep their old life if that's based in Baltimore. And that's what I meant by having it all. That in a world where you have to move to Seattle to work for Amazon, that's a more binding constraint for some than others. And I think that firms will have a more diverse workforce because of opening these sub-headquarters and allowing workers to engage in mixed part-time remote work. Mac?
Yeah, so I see it going a couple of ways. So I think that's certainly a possibility. And another thing you might see is possibly increased bias in who is allowed to go work remotely. So if there are trust issues in terms of race or gender, you might see certain groups being favored and allowed greater leeway in terms of flexibility and remote work where others might not.
Mac, I want to push back. I hear what you just said. In a world where some bosses might not give the benefit of the doubt to workers they don't know from groups that they don't have much experience with, in a world of remote work, you might allow for more auditions. So I like your point, but in my new book, I argue the reverse. So we're not going to get into a fight on national TV, but it's become cheaper to audition workers if you do it remotely. Give them a 3-week assignment and see if it works. And if firms know that they can do this short-run trial, my intuition is they'll take more chances with groups that they haven't hired from. So the loser here would be, Ivy League econ majors who investment banks just always hire these guys because that's what they've always done. in a world of remote work with auditions, you can turn to community colleges and be much more democratic about who you audition, because if it turns out to be a bad match, you just say thank you, but no thanks.
Yeah, and Zoom has certainly reduced the barrier to things like interviewing when you have to get people in the same physical space. So it does allow for much more matching in that sense.
Because it would be a shame if there was a very talented young person who, because she doesn't have the right credential, never gets a shot. And so, Zach, I'm optimistically claiming, without any evidence, that in our new post-COVID remote work economy, that she will get her shot, because firms using AI and working with Bayard and other firms will find her, and the gains to trade will occur.
Yeah, absolutely. And, and I think it's important to also note that, if we think of it from an employer branding perspective, and think of the way companies are positioning themselves and positioning the roles that may be available remotely, that there is kind of this sense of realism in that companies are not all in the same spot in terms of diversifying their workforce. And I think it's important to make sure that through your branding and through your communication, you're accurately representing the opportunities that are available. Because I think, one thing when we look at branding and its ability to attract and on the other side kind of retain key talent for companies across the world, I think you cause a different problem if you misrepresent roles and opportunity at the front end, then you can create very, very dangerous problems on the other side of that. So it's important from a branding perspective to bring that sense of reality to the way in which you do that. Perfect. I think that's it for the questions. So again, we certainly appreciate everybody joining. We appreciate everybody sticking around and hearing us out, and certainly appreciate the questions as well. I'll wrap it up there, give everybody a few minutes back in the day. And thanks again, Matt and Mac, for joining. Thoroughly enjoyed the conversation. You'll see kind of recordings of this come out in the coming days, so look out for that. And if you have any follow-up questions, please feel free to send them our way.